Hi, everybody. Okay, this is the breakdown that I promised of the Age of Deception or the Age of Deceit videos. I had posted both of those at they were over 3 hours long each, and I had promised to break them down into segments so that people could download them more easily, and hopefully we can reach more people because there are millions, untold millions of people who would never click on a video that says it's 3 hours long, whether they were interested in the topic or not. But that being said, let me slide this over and show you guys. Over 400,000 people just in the last 2 months since I uploaded the first Age of Deceit video did click on it and watch it. So that has to restore your faith in humanity. People are waking up. People are absolutely waking up to what is going on around us. But anyway, as promised, this is these two videos here are going to be broken down into one 8-part series called the Age of Deceit series. And I'll put different subtitles behind the Age of Deceit title in every title line because this series is packed with information. There are 1,000 different things discussed in this series. It's not just one thing that we just beat over and over for 6 hours. We go through a ton of different topics. So I'll put those in the subtitle in the title line behind each one, but it'll be 8 parts. So this part you're watching right now is only one part of an 8-part series. And as always, I do encourage you, please watch all of the parts, because especially part 4, which would be the end of this full version, and part 8, which would be the end of the second full version video, both of those parts are really the most shocking. So it would be a shame if you watch just the first parts, which are more of an introduction to the topic, and you missed out on the really shocking information. And vice versa, I don't encourage skipping forward just to those parts, because the whole point of putting all of this together in one place in context is a laying the foundation sort of process so that people can receive this information, because a lot of it is really fringy and it's hard for them to understand it unless you put it in context of everything else that is going on around us. If you take just that one little interesting part out, like everybody does in a 8-minute sound bite, then it's just parody to most people. So that's why I put it all together in one place and try to bring these puzzle pieces together. So if you are interested in this type of subject matter at all, please do take the time to watch the entire series. Even if it takes you a couple of months, please do, because there are some real gems in every single episode of this series. But anyway, the point of all that is that they are very consciously putting a spell on us and messing with our minds.
That thought process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while. It's a social validation feedback loop because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. Understood this consciously, and we did it anyway.
They are employing all sorts of scientific methods of hypnotism, is essentially what it is. It's hypnotism. The only reason we call it magic is because it's occult. So it's hidden. It's hidden from us. So we don't understand it, but they understand it, and they are hypnotizing our brains. That's why I have that entire series of videos called Hidden in Plain Sight, about the biggest secrets hidden in plain sight. Everything is hidden in plain sight because they're blinding our minds to it. It's invisible to us, even though it's right in front of our faces. So anyway, if you want more on that, I really encourage you to watch this video that I did called Shocking: Who Switched Off Our Brains? And it talks about the science behind this and how to reprogram our brains, because by them directing the energy circuits of our brain, it grows like a tree, because each of those synapses in our brains, when they fire, when they're stimulated and they fire, they grow. They literally grow. Like when you build muscle in your arms, when you work out a certain muscle, it grows. Well, it's the same with the electrical circuits of our brain. So by them continually stimulating us with this trauma-based mind control, then our brain functions that way. It naturally, energy, electricity travels through the path of least resistance. So this is scientific. They have literally trained our brains to function and see reality a certain way. And another thing I go into in this video that I think is a must see is epigenetics. Because DNA, we have a lot of DNA in us that is switched off, and that is done through epigenetics. So like one thing I show in there is this experiment with two mice who are genetically identical. They are genetically identical twins, or you could say clones, I guess. But the scientists, through feeding them certain feed, through our food, through what we eat, all of this GMO, genetically modified food, but in this experiment, they fed the mice specific food and it switched off certain genes in one of the mice. So by switching those genes off, even though they were genetically identical mice, they had the same exact DNA, they manifested completely differently. They had different hair colors. One of them got really fat, you know, like we're seeing with the obesity problem since the GMO foods were introduced. All of that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's a really interesting video and it's along these lines. So I encourage you to go watch that if you want to know how to reprogram your brain or understand how your brain was programmed and why you see the world the way you do. If you don't believe that they are isolating genes and trying to genetically manipulate and socially engineer humanity based on turning off and on certain genes using viruses, you're just not paying attention. You're just not paying attention to scientific development. This is all the way back in 2004, almost 15 years ago. Here's the Time magazine cover talking about scientists isolating what they call the God gene. Now here's a scientific presentation from those scientists at the Pentagon, a Department of Defense presentation in 2005. Here's the date, 4/13/2005 of the presentation, where they were saying under the guise, right, of fighting terrorism, this is how you fight religious radicals. And this scientist is flat out saying that they have isolated genetic markers in people who are spiritual and religious, and that they can tamper with these people's DNA by using viruses and distributing them by aerosols through the air to shut off the genes that allow us to access the spiritual parts of reality. So if you don't believe that they've already thought this thing through and even developed the technology, and this is Department of Defense, and that they have militarized it, they have weaponized it to shut off our genes that allow us to access spiritual realities. So if you're wondering why it's so hard to reach people these days, there's a lot of reasons.
We have individuals who are religious fundamentalists, religious fanatics, and this is the expression, RT-PCR, real-time PCR expression of the VMAT2 gene. Over here, we have individuals. So let me complete. So over here, we have individuals who are not particularly fundamentalist, not particularly religious, and you can see there's a much reduced expression of this particular gene, the VMAT2 gene. Another evidence that supports our hypothesis for the development of this approach.
What you see here is by spreading this virus, we're going to eliminate individuals from donning on a bomb vest and going into a market and blowing up the market.
So our hypothesis is that these are fanatical people, that they have overexpression of the VMAT2 gene, and that by vaccinating them against this, we'll eliminate this behavior.
But the presentation goes on quite a bit further and in depth about showing brain scans and the parts of the brains that light up when people are read religious texts, and how this part of the brain will light up with disgust for religious texts. But you just heard it for yourself. The proposition back 15 years ago was that they would vaccinate humans against the God gene, like a chemical lobotomy. That even back then it was completely possible that they could engineer a way to turn off our DNA so that we can't hear God. And then the whole brainwashed, atheist, perverse cultures going around saying these things like, well, if God's real, how come I can't see him? Well, if God's real, how come I can't hear him? And it's an unbelievable struggle to communicate with them scientifically. I mean, that's what I've dedicated my life to, my website to. All of it is to show them that from the beginning, these demons, these Nephilim races, genetically contaminated us, and their excommunication, they were excommunicated from God so that they could no longer perceive those higher frequency dimensions. And then when we had that original sin, that original genetic sin that's been genetically passed down to every generation afterwards, now we are excommunicated because of that Genesis 6 contamination of the human gene pool, and before and after, that now humans are excommunicated from those higher spiritual dimensions. And of course, we vary across the spectrum of how many people are genetically inclined to still be able to perceive or have extrasensory perception and that type of thing. But largely, the human race was excommunicated from the genetic contamination of the human gene pool that was meant to excommunicate only the fallen angels from the heavenly realms. And right down to this very instant, our scientists are developing ways to ensure and prolong our excommunication from God, some wittingly and some unwittingly. Okay, I want to close this video out by jumping back to the Hollywood Hills and talk about those who are doing it wittingly. This is unbelievable. You can't make this stuff up. Okay, so not only do we have the Hollywood magic wand coming out of Los Angeles, the city of angels in California, but yes, in the Hollywood Hills, there is an enormous rich community called Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus in the Hollywood Hills, where all of the stars live. Oh yeah, it's real. No, they're not narcissists. Why would you say that? Just because they call themselves stars and put stars on the boulevard with their handprints in them and name their communities Mount Olympus. No, no narcissism there at all. So you can look it up on the map, but it's Mount Olympus is a luxury residential community in the Hollywood Hills. Oh, the city of angels. But the part of the Hollywood Hills that I want to focus on the most right now and in this video with is Laurel Canyon. Okay, see this facility right here? Now it's privately owned. But that is part of a highly classified military complex that was built during World War II and was operational through 1969, nestled in Laurel Canyon. So let's just look at a couple of the main streets all around this facility. It says right here, some of the main side streets are Mount Olympus, Kirkwood, Wonderland. Do you think that's a coincidence that those are the street names around this highly classified MK Ultra military establishment? Wonderland? And I know those are harsh words when you hear people say, oh, Hollywood's a tranny factory or something like that. But the word factory, at least, that's a fair analogy. That's a fair analogy. So let me show you some evidence for that right now. Okay, so this is the Lookout Mountain Laboratory. It's an enormous base. So although this was built and designed during the exact era that Hitler's propaganda minister was setting the same thing up over in Europe, they claim that this was actually built as like an anti-aircraft missile base. And it does have some helicopter landing pads and stuff on it, but that's about where the resemblance to that sort of thing would end, because it's a movie studio. So again, it goes back to how much you believe in coincidences, that they built this motion picture movie studio at the exact same time that the first talking movies started coming out, you know, in the golden age of Hollywood, right? Well, here's a government facility that is a motion picture studio built at that exact time. But they do change their story shortly after World War II and admit that it morphed into a movie studio, but only to secretly develop the films of the nuclear tests. So when the atomic bomb was first created and all of that, and they were filming the detonations in the desert and things like that, this is supposedly why they set up this secret base to develop those films. But let me play you a clip of Dave McGowan. He's done a tremendous amount of research on this subject. So as I talk about this facility, I'll be intermingling clips from interviews with him.
Mountain Laboratories was a top secret U.S. Air Force installation nestled up in Laurel Canyon, the existence of which remained unknown until fairly recently, even within the conspiracy community. Very few people seem to be aware of the existence of this facility, and was said to be the world's most complete self-contained film studio. The main purpose, according to various sources, was to process the raw film stock from the early atomic bomb tests, the nuclear weapons tests. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because, like I say, this was a fully operational film studio that capable of doing everything in-house. They had, every animation department, editing facilities, film vaults, sound stages, everything to make a film from soup to nuts. And, to process raw film stock, all you really need is a darkroom. Could have been anywhere. There was no need to fly that film all the way, to this remote outpost in Laurel Canyon.
Another ridiculous fail with the cover story about this facility is, why would Marilyn Monroe have a classified clearance badge to an Atomic Energy Commission facility? They've stuck to that story about the atomic energy and all of that. Yet at the same time, all of these Hollywood actors had security clearance to enter this facility. What do they have to do with nuclear bombs?
Some real heavyweights from Hollywood, performers like Marilyn Monroe, John Wayne, as you mentioned, I think Jimmy Stewart, and very heavyweight filmmakers, like I think John Ford and I don't know, a couple others, were involved. They had security clearance to work in this facility, and yet no one seems to know exactly what they did there, and they remained remarkably closed-lipped about it. Pretty much all of them, as far as I know, went to their deaths without ever even mentioning the existence of this facility, let alone that they had any association with it.
And then officially, this facility ceased to be operational in 1969. And then a private person purchased it, but they turned it into a celebrity rehab. Yeah, a celebrity rehab. And here's the address right here. 8935 Wonderland Avenue. This is where they took the celebrities during their breakdowns and stuff. But like we talked about in the last video, that it's very common for their programming to break down. And we see these breakdowns, especially with the Disney kids like Britney Spears. It's really common to see them break down, and then they secret them away to these facilities and reprogram them, or if it's even them who comes back out, because at this point, nothing would shock me. But one thing I do know for sure is that this Lookout Mountain facility started out as this giant Hollywood production studio with everything anyone would ever need, and it was kept completely secret, and the cover story doesn't make any sense. And even though I don't have any secret footage to see what was going on inside that facility, I am going to show you what came out of Laurel Canyon during that era. Absolutely no doubt that it's a star factory. It's a factory.
There were so many bands that emerged out of the Laurel Canyon scene. And one of the things that we're going to find that is the primary premise of the book is almost all of these bands had within their family background military intelligence, some form of military ties, political ties. I'm going to name some of the bands out of Laurel Canyon because there's so many. The Byrds, The Doors, Buffalo Springfield, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, Steppenwolf, Love, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, the Turtles, the Mamas and the Papas, the Flying Burritos Brothers, the Eagles, America. There was the singer-songwriters, Jackson Browne, Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Leonard Ronstadt, Carole King. It's nuts.
Yeah, it's amazing how much talent poured out of such a tiny geographic area over such a very short period of time.
So seriously, What are the odds? Back during that era, there was only about 1,000 people living in that community. And every single enormous international phenomenon on the music forefront of the whole world came out, all of those people, all of those groups at the same time. Seriously, there was that much talent in that little handful of people in that neighborhood. And keep in mind that they're still not admitting that this studio here has anything to do with it. They're not admitting that this is a Hollywood or a celebrity star factory. So just coming out of here, out of these houses and the pubs and the little bars and clubs, all of these international mega superstars like the Eagles, America, the Monkees, the Doors, the Beach Boys. Yeah, all right here. They must have the best karaoke night ever at that pub. And I'm going to show you a ton of absurd phenomena surrounding all of that in just a second. But let's jump back to one that wasn't on the list he just read, and that's Jim Morrison. Because overnight, Jim Morrison was just like this short-haired, clean-cut, preppy kid who launched into phenomenal rock star status and admits openly that he doesn't know how to read music. He doesn't know how to write music. He never really even had an interest in music or went to any concerts or anything like that. He just wasn't musical. He didn't play a musical instrument and none of that. So, but overnight, he is an international superstar. And coincidence of all coincidences, of course, he comes from a military family, and not just any military family. His dad was the naval commander over the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So it could be said that Jim Morrison's dad started the Vietnam War. And besides his key role in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, he just also happened to be in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, to witness the attack on Pearl Harbor.
And certainly the most famous or enigmatic figure to emerge from that scene would have to be Jim Morrison, the Lizard King.
The Lizard King, the Lizard King.
It gets even weirder because you discussed the fact that Jim was not really a likely candidate to be a rock star, and he wasn't even a musician.
Yeah, he had no musical background at all, by his own account. He had never had much interest in music, even as a fan. He said he'd only been to like 1 or 2 concerts, in his life. He didn't really listen to a lot of music. He never viewed himself as a singer. Not long before he emerged as this figure that we see here, it was a very much different Jim Morrison.
So again, we see this alter ego. I don't know that I would call it like a multiple personality disorder type MK Ultra thing, but there is no denying that he was instantly reinvented to play this character, Jim Morrison of the Doors. And then this character that he's playing here was broadcast simultaneously, instantaneously, worldwide. I mean, having a good agent is one thing, but what we saw coming out of Laurel Canyon was way beyond having a good agent. Okay, we'll talk some more about Jim Morrison in a minute, but let's take a quick look at all of the other counterculture superstars that were churned out of Laurel Canyon and how many of them also came from these military families and even came from generational royalty. Royal families. Where have we seen that before?
I couldn't believe it. Papa John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas.
He was the son of a career Marine Corps officer who also various other members of his family were very closely tied to the military as well. His mother, his older sister, and his first wife were all career Defense Department employees. And he himself was prepped for a military career. I believe he was a West Point appointee or Annapolis, one of the two. I get confused because there's so many of these people have such very similar backgrounds. And not only that, but his first wife was also a direct descendant of John Adams, the second president of the United States, which is another thing that you will find is that some of these people, in addition to having a military or military intelligence background, a lot of them kind of come from what we could call like royal sort of the blue blood bloodline, so to speak.
The most unlikely person, David Crosby, of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
He was a Bird, one of the founding members of the Birds, the original members, and the guy who emerged as the biggest star. I mean, the name that we remember today. Most people don't remember Gene Clark and Chris Hillman, and his full name is David Van Cortlandt Crosby, and he is a direct descendant of three interrelated families: the Van Cortlandts, the Van Rensselaer, and the Van Schuyler. His family tree includes just people occupying virtually every position of prominence that you can imagine, back to the founding of the country. Revolutionary War generals, Civil War generals, judges, senators, congressmen, governors, and his father, did naval intelligence work during World War II. So,
well, Stephen Stills in the same band was an interesting character as well.
Stephen Stills was actually in Buffalo Springfield. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, they then later joined forces as Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But yeah, Stephen Stills, his father appears to have been some type of a covert operative. He's described in various biographies as a mercenary or soldier of fortune or various euphemisms. And he spent a lot of time bopping around various hot spots in Central and South America where it just happened to be places where we had a lot of covert operations going on, and so Stephen moved around a lot, and to various grew up partially in military bases and military schools in and around Central America, which we find time after time after
Frank
time.
Zappa.
Frank Zappa, yeah, according to the leader of the Mothers of Invention. But Zappa's father was a chemical warfare engineer, initially assigned to the Edgewood Arsenal, which is where Frank was born and spent the first 7 years of his life. They actually lived in military housing on the base, and he went to school and lived the first 7 years of his life at the home of U.S. chemical warfare, strangely enough.
And Parsons, America.
America, all three of them were sons of Air Force officers who met on a Air Force base in the UK that was known as being an intelligence outpost. So all their fathers were most likely Air Force intelligence officers. They were certainly Air Force officers. And yeah, they first got together on a military base. Jackson Browne was born on a military base in post-war Germany during Reconstruction.
Graham Parsons, another kind of blue blood type character in a way.
He was very much of a blue blood, yeah. His family originally owned the majority of the citrus groves in Florida and Georgia, and a very, very wealthy clan that also included the Hershey family and the founder of the Hershey chocolate empire. So yeah, once again, he came from a very, very blue blood family that had deep roots, going back to the founding of the country. The guy who actually raised him, Robert Parsons, who gave him his name, his adoptive father, appears to have been an intelligence operative also. He was very closely involved with training exile Cuban groups in Florida Everglades to topple the Castro regime, and it's not a big mystery who was in charge of running all those operations. So if that's what his father was doing, then obviously he had some kind of a CIA connection. So, and his father, who he didn't know for all that long, because he died when he was fairly young, shot, listed as a suicide, although that's kind of questionable. And he was military. He was, I think, a fighter pilot.
Okay, but I think you get the picture. The name of his book, Dave McGowan's book, is Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and he's written other books about serial killers and this type of programming and all of that. But I think you get it, that all of these groups that we idolize and worship and think we're so awesome, they were just actors on a stage. They were created and put on the stage for us. And they weren't anti-establishment. That was just a role they were playing. They were the establishment. They weren't anti-war. They were the military families. They were created by and come from the military-industrial complex. It's all a farce. And from the beginning, you can see their sigils. You have the lightning bolt, like the Eagles came out of Laurel Canyon. You have the lightning bolt, you have the Illuminati pyramid, you have the as above, so below. I mean, it's just endless. They were programming us. This is MK Ultra for the masses. I mean, right from the beginning, this is the Baphomet. This is Baphomet worship. People say, oh, it was just a cow skull because they're blind. Well, no, they still do it in the music industry. This isn't just a motorcycle. This is a Baphomet, see? And this one is almost identical to Jonathan Kleck's dead sheep with the tongue hanging out that he shows all throughout all of the Catholic Jesuit art and well beyond. And the whole world's chanting along with the song Hotel California. It just resonates, right? Resonates with people, and they don't even know what it means. To this day, people are like, what does that song mean? This is what it means. Hotel California. It's inside of a spirit. I stood there in the doorway. I heard the mission bell. I was thinking to myself, this could be heaven or this could be hell. Her mind is Tiffany twisted. Remember in the last video I showed you Tiffany's Universe, which is the transgender beauty pageant where it's all men, but they're all turned into women. She got a lot of pretty, pretty boys that she called friends. How they dance in the courtyard. Sweet summer sweat. Some dance to remember, some dance to forget. A lot of pretty, pretty boys. This is the eunuchs. This is what we're talking about, the transgender. She got a lot of pretty, pretty boys that dance for her. So I called up the captain, please bring me my wine. We know that wine is the word used for the Holy Spirit, for the anointing, the wine. Please bring me my wine. He said, we haven't had that spirit here since 1969. Remember, I said Lookout Mountain was operational until 1969? And she said, we are all just prisoners here of our own device. Last thing I remember, I was running for the door. I had to find a passage back to the place I was before. Relax, said the night man. We are programmed. We are programmed to receive. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And that reminds me of the tragedies, like I said, with Amy Winehouse. And like I discussed in the last video, the suicide rate up to 40 to 50% amongst transgenders. And this is like a veiled threat. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. We are all just prisoners here of our own device that they have chosen. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all of these people coming out of Laurel Canyon are all transgender. MK Ultra has tons of nested programs going on simultaneously. I think this is more just the sigil magic and the frequency technology and all of that being employed on humanity. Although if you look closely at some of these, I think they would be candidates for transvestigation. But my point with presenting the Laurel Canyon scene and all of that is just to show that these were actors and they were cast for these parts on the world stage.
For example, the birds. You point out in the book that the birds, frankly, were not that good in the beginning, and they didn't really have much gear. Did they share a space with Vito Polakis or something? Because that whole,
They used his
birds,
studio as a rehearsal space. Yeah,
tell us about that, because they just kind of
blew
blew up out of nothing, and there's weird people in the band that don't know how to play.
Yeah, really look at the beginning, the genesis of these bands. It doesn't really seem very organic, you know, in the sense that these were just a lot of guys that were friends and fellow musicians that had similar musical interests and got together and decided to form a band, and, you know, just sort of a natural progression of things. This is more like some of these bands had definitely had the appearance of being cast. And the Byrds, which was the first one out of the gate, was probably the most obvious in that regard, in that their entire rhythm section literally did not know how to play their instruments. Their drummer had never picked up a pair of drumsticks in his life. He had played like bongo drums or something. And their bass player was a very accomplished musician, but he was a bluegrass mandolin player, and yet he was the guy that they drafted to be in the world's first folk rock band, to play bass, guitar. I mean, and despite the fact that they, you know, most of them did not really know how to play their instruments and did not have, you know, professional quality equipment to even perform with, they were very quickly signed and provided with studio space and rehearsal space, recording space, got brand new instruments, and all of a sudden they were a band.
And they were created by the military-industrial complex, by these royal bloodlines, or the ones who consider themselves the ruling class royals. The actors on the stage are all family members. They're never just, people don't just get on a bus and go to Hollywood and succeed. They don't just become rock stars. That's all a lie. They're all family members. And I'm going to show you some super shocking stuff about that here in a minute. And I'll put the link below to Dave's entire interview so you can hear more of these connections. But I want to point out some things you may not have considered. One is, back during that era from World War II throughout the 60s, Los Angeles now, we see that as, oh, well, that's Hollywood. That's where the stars come from. That's, you know, all of that. But back then it was not. The scene of Broadway and the drama and the musicians and all of that was New York and somewhat Nashville and Detroit. But there was nothing in LA yet. So they expect us to believe not only did all these super megastar bands come from there, but all these people from all over the world just packed up and moved to LA, where there was no music industry, to launch their careers in the music industry. That not a single one of them moved to New York or to Detroit or to Nashville. No, of course not. They all go the complete opposite direction. You can't get any further away from New York than going out to the West Coast. So yeah, all of these music megastars go as far as they could possibly get away from the music industry hubs to try and find a place to launch themselves into superstardom. Really? Really? This is what we're supposed to believe? But the masses believe it. I mean, I just don't even think they've even thought about it. I don't think they're even aware of world history or the history of the state or the different eras of the industrial age, that how these things came about. I just think people are so uneducated, so dumbed down by the quote unquote public education system that they don't even know where they are. They don't have any idea. They don't even know they're caught in a trap. It's just so easy to catch them. Just a little bit of bait. That's all it takes, a tiny bit of bait, and they'll run head first right into the trap. And if you try to tell them, hey, that's a trap, stop throwing your money at these celebrities, stop downloading that music, come out of Babylon, stop watching their programs, they're programming you, they're called programs. You try to tell them that it's a trap, that don't take the bait. You show them right to their face, like all the stuff I'm showing right here in this video, and they're, oh, you tinfoil hat wearer, oh, you conspiracy theorist. They mock you and run headfirst into the trap. So why would they create an entire music industry and all of this? Well, this is why. And if you want more information on this subject, here are a couple of videos that I put up that were dedicated just to this subject, with a lot of detail and a lot of patents and scientific information and evidence. Here's one. It's got that Beats headset thumbnail, and it's titled "Music Has Been Weaponized Since the 1940s, 440 Hertz and 432 Hertz." That has a ton of information. And here's another one. Whistleblower tells all, frequency experiments on unwitting American cities. And this isn't just about the music industry. This is talking about out on the West Coast. Somebody who worked for these companies is giving his testimony of what he saw, where they were covertly doing tests over entire city blocks and entire areas, beaming these frequencies to change mood. So it's not just programming your mind with triggers and sigils and behaviors and things like that, but there's an actual frequency range for each mood, for each emotion, and they know that. They know what the hertz ranges are. And the music industry is employing this on a massive scale, unbelievable scale. And people started to wake up to the Satanism in the music industry back decades ago. Remember how people started to discover, wait, if you play this song backwards, it says Hail Satan or and stuff like that. And they found it again and again and again with every single group and all these different albums. And then it just kind of became a joke and moved on. Like there couldn't really be a worldwide satanic coven, right? So everybody just kind of, oh, that's blah, blah, blah. But anyway, it's true. It's all true. That stuff was on the albums. These people are Satanists, which hopefully this wakes up even a few people. You have to see that depression and anxiety are epidemic. They are epidemic in our culture. You have to turn this stuff off. You have to. It's killing you. The truth will set you free. We're trying to set you free right now. Turn it off. You will feel so much different if you turn it off. You'll be able to think clearly. You'll be able to experience empathy. You won't be in such a dark, depressed mood. And not just the mainstream music. We have to turn off these mainstream Hollywood programs. People have gone their entire lifetimes and never stepped out from under the cult preachers for, maybe 7 days. I mean, seriously, there are people who have lived their entire lifetimes and have never gone 7 full days without standing under the preaching of this cult. I mean, like my ex-husband was one. I mean, the day the new movies came out, I think it was Tuesday was new release day, he was at the Red Box. I mean, or he was downloading them digitally or at Family Video, or often couldn't even wait for that, had to go to the theater and see them, was just at their beck and call. And I know he's not an anomaly. This is how people live. This is why the video stores and the red boxes and stuff make it, is because people are just waiting for the next sermon from these people. And not just the movies. Now they've got these Big Brother screens in all of our homes that people just cannot, I mean, they will tear each other apart on Black Friday to make sure they have their screen. And then their whole life is come home from work, from the labor force, as a human resource like gas or coal, come home from their work for the military industrial complex and sit down on their couch or in their easy chair and stare at the TV all night long until it's time to go to sleep and get back up and go back to work for them. Come home, watch TV, go to work, watch TV, go to work. And they think that's life. Or I guess now the bread and circus includes video games just as much. And they can't break the cycle. They never get out from under it long enough to think clearly. The subliminals, the frequencies, and even the surface message becomes their identity. So I want to take just a second and show you the connection, because these people came out of Laurel Canyon too. At the very same time that they were producing this music industry, like Jack Nicholson here, he was considered one of the Young Turks, and they were producing this group of young, beautiful people that they were putting on the world stage through the movies, simultaneously while they were putting these others on the world stage through the music industry. And they were intertwined because they couldn't get enough people interested in these bands that didn't even know how to play their instruments. They used these people to go in and draw crowds into the clubs. And even further, there were no clubs when they created the bands. They had to actually create infrastructure to promote this. So simultaneously, they created the bands, then they went out and bought the properties and created the clubs, but they couldn't get anyone to go to the clubs because nobody had heard of them and nobody listened to this type of music. People were clean cut, back in the 50s before they introduced this counterculture. So they had a troupe that traveled around of these hippie dancers that would go club to club to club, and they would get in free and they would dance, and people would come to see this weird hippie, crazy dressed people, this sort of freak show. They actually called the hippies freaks at first. So that was the draw. That's how they got an organic audience to go in. They wouldn't come listen to the music, but they would come to see this quote unquote freak show of dancers, this audience that they had created to go club to club. And then they also sent in the Young Turks, which was this troupe of actors. And they heavily advertised these stars going to these clubs. So people started going to the clubs to see if they could bump into these stars. And once they got them in there, then they were under the influence of the frequencies and the drugs. I mean, that was the culture. They introduced the drugs simultaneously to the frequencies and created this enormous drug culture, which we still have today. Whether that's legalized drugs or illegal drugs, it's all the same thing. The crime syndicate owns Big Pharma, and they also own the cartels, the illegal drug cartels. So it's all one big thing. Whether you're buying their antidepressants to cope with this world of darkness they've created around us, or whether you're just a regular drug addict like the hippies, I would say that we are still largely a drug addicted culture. So I just can't say it enough. This is MK Ultra for the masses. If you feel hopeless and helpless and depressed and all of that, then you need to come out of Babylon. You need to stop programming your mind with their garbage and stop taking their drugs and come back to life. You don't have to be a zombie.
Which didn't really start in Haight-Ashbury. It started here in Los Angeles. Then we also have the entrance of the Young Turks. Explain to us who the Young Turks are.
Yeah, that was the other factor. The Young Turks were the young, up-and-coming Hollywood crowd. You know, the beautiful people of Hollywood who were on the rise. People like Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, Peter and Jane Fonda, Sharon Tate, Bruce Dern, Dennis Hopper, various others who I can't think of their names right now. But anyway, they were all very much a part of the scene too, and a lot of them lived in and or hung out in Laurel Canyon and had a very, very close symbiotic relationship with the musicians of Laurel Canyon. And they were the other big factor in drawing people out to these clubs, because it was also publicized that they were there. And so, you know, the initial attraction of these clubs when they first started opening up was, number one, to see these crazy hippies, you know, doing these wild dance moves on the dance floor, and the opportunity to possibly rub elbows with Steve McQueen or Jane Mansfield or, you know, these young glamorous Hollywood stars. It helped put these bands really on the map initially.
Well, strangely enough, the coincidences continue, because most of these actors that you're discussing had the same military intelligence backgrounds.
Yeah, they're very curious. Yeah, Dennis Hopper acknowledged not long before his death that his father had been a career intelligence officer, beginning with the OSS, continuing with the in his official bios, he's described as like a farmer and a postman or something like that. But Hopper actually acknowledged that his dad was, in fact, a career intelligence officer.
And of course, here's a clip of the Young Turks. Here's Jack Nicholson giving a standing ovation to Roman Polanski. And this is 2003. So this is long after. Everybody knows that he's a pedophile and it's all out in the open and he's fled the country. And the Academy Awards, and they still give him an Academy Award, these people, this cabal. And here's the Young Turk, Jack Nicholson, note the dark glasses indoors, standing ovation for this pedophile. There's Meryl Streep too, there's tons of them. Scorsese, they all stood up and gave a standing ovation to this cabal pedophile that had fled the country. Just a little side note here, I had to redact the clip that was right here to show the actual footage of Roman Polanski winning and them giving him a standing ovation. I've been trying to get this video uploaded for 5 days, and every time it uploads, they block it worldwide. So I finally got it narrowed down to this. It was like 20 seconds of this that they won't let me use. So if you want to see for yourself, it's right there. Of all the things that I say on this channel, but yeah, clearly they are the most protective of their pedophile ring. And if you don't know who Roman Polanski is, Roman Polanski's sexual abuse case in March of 1977, film director Roman Polanski was arrested and charged in Los Angeles with 5 offenses against a 13-year-old girl: rape by use of drugs, perversion, sodomy, lewd and lascivious act upon a child. He's not just a rapist and a pedophile. He's also the husband of Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate of the Young Turks. He was the husband of Sharon Tate, who Charles Manson's cult came in and sacrificed the child in her womb and killed her. That was Roman Polanski's wife. And like I mentioned earlier, this was no coincidence. The Manson family stayed at the Beach Boys' house and partied with them and stuff. Yeah, it seems like an anomaly now. Everybody's like, oh, how'd that happen? Oh, whatever, and they dismiss it. No, because these were all from the same family. The Beach Boys were one of the groups that came out of Laurel Canyon. And Charles Manson was a member of the Order of the Orient, the secret society. He was more in the drug cartel wing of the family. I mean, they'll admit that it's a cult, that part of the family is a cult, but they won't tell you how they just walked right in to Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski's house and knew the layout of the house and how they were part of this whole Hollywood Hills scene the whole time. But again, with the hidden in plain sight thing, they flat out said these were ritual slayings. This was a ritual. They flat out tell you that they were hypnotized, what I've been talking about this whole video. And don't forget the Helter Skelter connection. Remember to the Beatles song, Helter Skelter, that the family said that they were being programmed with this music to murder. And they wrote Helter Skelter from the Beatles song all over the walls in blood. And I talked about more of that in the last video, the last Age of Deceit video that just went up. How the Beatles openly put Satanist Aleister Crowley on their album. And, you know, it's not a secret. It's an open secret. It's right in front of our faces. And the cult ritual sacrifices of the Manson family, that wasn't the only one. Do you guys remember the Wonderland murderers? How I just told you like 30 minutes ago that the address of the Laurel Canyon MK Ultra facility at Lookout Point was on Wonderland Avenue? Well, here's another slaying on Wonderland Avenue. The quiet, winding streets of LA's Laurel Canyon are home to many of Hollywood's elite, but the swanky enclave has many ghosts, most notably the bloody and gory Wonderland murders. The article goes on to say police have gone on record to say it was more gruesome than the Manson family killings at the home of director Roman Polanski and his wife, the late Sharon Tate. But again, it's drug related. The Wonderland gang was an influential group of drug dealers in Los Angeles. They thrived during the cocaine-fueled days of the late 70s and 80s. This was this drug culture that the CIA produced. And they had their cartels all the way down to the street level, just like we see today. What it's MS-13 is the leftist arm of the drug distribution, and their hitmen and stuff like that. Well, it was the same thing back then. Even the very fact that they coined the phrase the Young Turks, that they called themselves the Young Turks, that has nothing to do with up and coming new fresh talent. You know who the Young Turks are? The Young Turks were responsible for one of the worst genocides in world history against Christians. They just ambushed one day and pulled all the little school children out of their school while they were away from their parents, and it was horrific. I did a video about it. It was back in the Q series. It's called Q Analysis Setup, Armenian Connection, Young Turk. Because you see, they use that same phrase again in the mainstream media with this fake news. The Young Turks, and their background is this shredded American flag, just torn to shreds and everything, and they're Armenian. So I know you can't tell me they don't know what the Young Turks means, because that's where the genocide happened. Armenia. They're laughing in our faces about Christian genocide. It's unbelievable. And I show in that video the analytics of searches on the term QAnon, and you can see, you know, how they do the world graph and shows where interest by region, that next to the United States, Armenia, there were more people following all of the QAnon buzz from Armenia, than a little tiny Armenia, than anywhere else in the world. And to me, that just showed that they were tracking. They were watching the videos that we made. They were watching the blogs. They were watching the forums. And they were doing it, obviously, from Armenia. And then I go back in world history and talk about the genocide that happened in Armenia, performed by the Young Turks. And then I go into these symbols that we see in everything from the Russian sickle to China to the Arab nations. I talk about this symbolism. And when I trace the symbolism of these genocidal maniacs throughout world history and all of the different countries, I show how it's tied into the fez, because that's where we get the fez. Anybody ever wonder why these old white guys in America are wearing these Middle Eastern fez hats? And why the Shriners, who so many of them claim to be Christian, are wearing these Muslim genocidal maniacs logos on their hats? But anyway, all of that stuff is in that Young Turks video. Okay, enough about the Young Turks. I want to end this Laurel Canyon stuff and talk about some of the mysterious deaths in this that come out of these players on the world stage.